Good morning, everybody. I'm Ellen Hanak. I am Vice President at the PPIC Public Policy Institute of California, and I'm the Director of the Water Policy Center here. And it's really delightful to spend this hour with all of you. We're going to be talking about improving California's water market with a real focus on how this is going to help us implement the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And this is work that was supported by several funders. I'd like to acknowledge them: the SD Bechtel Jr. Foundation,
Good morning,
Foundation.
everybody. I'm Ellen Hanak. I am Vice President
of the Water Funder Initiative Water Campaign. Thanks very much to all of them. The slides that I'm going to be showing you in a minute, as well as the report, are available on our website, so you can have a look at that later on. And actually, also this video this live video that we're doing now is going to be on our website probably tomorrow, so that you can watch it, have more fun watching it later. I would like to also just acknowledge that PPIC is a public charity. We do not take or support positions on any ballot measures or legislation, and do not support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. So today's program is basically me giving you a quick overview of what's a really complicated topic. And then I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Andrew Ayres, who's one of the authors of this report. And he's going to bring on a great panel to have a discussion. And at the end of that, we're going to save about 15 minutes for your questions. And the way to submit questions, you can see it right here. You pop an email to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And when you do that, please say who you are, because it's nice to be able to acknowledge you. Thank you. All right, so I think with that, I am gonna share my screen and we'll get going. Can you, let's see, this looks good. So, all right. Here we go. Okay, so here is the full title of the report. It's a hefty one, and you can see we also had a big cast of authors contributing to this study. And I want to also acknowledge Joy Collins, a research associate at PPIC, who helped with a lot of great data work for the study. And I want to acknowledge a large number of people who helped us. This is stakeholders at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, who helped us over the past couple of years by contributing in workshop discussions, focus group discussions, providing data, all of this to help us get a sense of how things are going in the water market and what are some ways to improve it so that we can help these tools, water marketing and banking, water trading and banking, help us to get our groundwater basins into balance. So thanks so much to all of you. And you're gonna get to see a little bit what we came up with in terms of some of the key recommendations in a minute. But first, just a little background on why we're interested in water trading and banking in the context of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Groundwater, as we all know, especially during droughts, is a really important drought reserve for California. By the time you get into the second and third dry year, you really need to lean on your groundwater very heavily. And one of our challenges in California is that we've been leaning on it too heavily for some decades now, such that we've got a lot of basins that are highly stressed, some of them overdrafted and really out of balance. And SGMA requires local water users to bring their basins into balance by the early 2040s. There are already plans underway for the most stressed basins, the critically overdrafted basins, and there are a whole bunch of new plans due in January of next year. And the plans that are in so far are really focusing a lot on expanding supply as a way of bringing the basins into balance, but it's also going to be the case in many basins that reducing demand will be necessary. And this is where trading comes in. Water trading, whether it's temporary or over a long-term basis or permanent sales, can significantly lower the cost of managing water demand. We found in the San Joaquin Valley, for example, that flexible trading within the valley alone could reduce the cost of managing demand and getting basins into balance by about 2/3. And that means a lot more jobs are saved, as well as just regional GDP and the regional economies. Banking, what we're calling groundwater banking, which is underground storage for specific parties. So this is groundwater recharge, but where there's actually some accounting done so that people who are putting in water have their name on it, kind of as with money in a bank. This is also a key market tool. Actually, a lot of times it relies on trading to access water for putting into the ground, but also goes through many of the same approval processes as water trading. So we've talked about both trading and banking in this report, and this is a key tool for augmenting supply and helping bring basins into balance that way, and also just helping to manage the climatic risk that we're facing in California, increasing climatic risk. So we have already an active surface water market in California. PPIC has been tracking this for the last 20 years. This shows you our latest update that goes through 2019, volumes traded annually. It's about 4% of typical water use in a given year that's traded between districts every year. What you see here is that it's been relatively flat over the last couple decades, although there's been a big shift in colors, where there's been a big shift from short-term or same year leases to longer-term and permanent deals, and that reflects efforts to make the process a little bit easier in terms of approvals by doing more upfront work to get those approvals done. Now, groundwater trading, I'm not showing you here. There's not that much of it. There is some groundwater trading in a few adjudicated basins, and there's a lot of interest in expanding groundwater trading as part of SGMA. We'll talk about that in a minute. But groundwater banking is something that California is actually known for. We don't do it everywhere, but we've got some of the most sophisticated underground water banks in the world. What this shows you is amounts stored in Kern County water banks. Those are the big ones there, the beige color, and then also Southern California, which mostly has heavily managed groundwater basins. They're also doing some banking of this type, where storing for specific parties in underground. And we think that there's a lot of potential for more. That we know there's a lot of interest in expanding this. So, what does it take? To do this? In the report, we talk about essential features of what we call effective and responsible markets. And this is effective means it works well. It's not really high cost to do it. You can engage in the transactions, fairly readily and get it done when you need to. And responsible means that you're making sure that you are doing it in a way that is not harming other folks. And so think about effective and responsible as those are two things that really kind of have to go together in order for markets to be helpful for us. And we identified 5 key things or essential features of effective and responsible markets. The first is having secure tradable rights to water. The second is having good accounting, basically reliable measurement and reporting and verification systems. The third is hydrologic connections, ability to get water between the parties that are the buyer and the seller. The fourth is transparent market information. This is not essential for a market to exist, but it's really key for having it function well and for making it equitable in the sense of, having the rules be known well by everybody, having the information on what's happening in the market be known. That doesn't mean details of every price of every trade, but it does mean a sense of kind of what's happening in terms of overall trends. And then the fifth, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a minute, is mechanisms for addressing third-party impacts. And that is ways to make sure that you are avoiding or mitigating any significant harm that might be caused by changing the way water is used. So this table is going to give us a quick view on how we're doing in these different areas of surface water trading, groundwater trading, and underground banking. So first, I showed you that we're doing the most right now in surface water trading. That's because we more or less, the answer is yes to that we do have secure tradable rights, and we do have, I would say, decent measurement and reporting and verification systems. We also have pretty decent hydrologic connections among parties. You can trade water from far up north, where one of our panelists, Thad Bettner, is, all the way down to down in the south where another one of our panelists, Kathy Cortner, is in the Mojave, because of all the interconnections that we've got in our water system. But I just highlight there that it needs work because there are some ways in which we need to improve it, and there are some bottlenecks that are key. Transparent market info, that is, I would say, okay, but could be better. And then mechanisms for addressing third-party impacts. We have a lot of mechanisms. We have a lot of controls on that. The challenge there is making it work effectively as well as responsibly. So now let's look quickly at groundwater trading and how that looks. And you can see a lot of not yets. You do see one green sign there for yes, which is that actually hydrologic connections, as long as we're talking about groundwater trading within a local basin, which is mainly the way groundwater trading is going to work in California, you actually don't need infrastructure as long as you can basically keep the accounting going. Somebody can pump in one place rather than pumping in another place. And as long as it's a closely connected basin, that can work hydrologically. But what you see is a bunch of not yets on all of those other requirements. And that's because we've been not managing our groundwater in a way that where folks know how much they can use and how much they can therefore sell. And therefore haven't been transparent market information set up or mechanisms for addressing impacts. But SGMA sets conditions up where this is now possible to do. And the groundwater sustainability agencies that have been created have the authority to set up trading systems. So it's an exciting time. Now, underground banking, it's kind of a mixed bag. A lot of the same, here I'm highlighting for places that don't already have a well set up groundwater bank. Some of the same challenges or things that need to be done as with groundwater trading. What I'm highlighting here also is that the hydrologic connections part needs work in the same way that it does for surface water trading, especially conveyance to get water, recharge water to places where we want to recharge it. So I mentioned third-party impacts. This is really a key issue in market design. Changing water use can affect other parties. There's a lot of protections in place for that. For surface water, you go through a lot of approvals in order to seeking to avoid harm. For groundwater, SGMA establishes new protections that are basically going to level the playing field on this. Plans have to avoid or mitigate significant undesirable effects of groundwater use. Now, this is key. With or without trading, that's going to be the key thing that plans have to do. But those same protections will apply to trading. And there's been a lot of concern and discussion about potential impacts of new trading on well-dependent communities in the rural areas. And we talk about this in the report. What I just highlight for you is that most of these issues really are more about making sure the plans have a good way of addressing the effects of overdraft. Trading is a sort of a secondary issue. If they're not addressing overdraft well, then that's the key concern. And trading itself, if done right, can actually help small communities and small growers. So what will it take to realize the market's potential? We've got 24 recommendations for you. I'm not going to go through them all here, but they're in the report and in a little policy brief. And I'm just going to run through at the very high level what we're talking about here. The first group of recommendations is about just laying the groundwork for well-designed groundwater markets. And that's basically taking advantage of the new authorities that SGMA provides to establish and enforce groundwater allocations. That is key. If you don't do that, you don't have rights that you can trade, really. Locals are going to have to be in the lead on this, the groundwater sustainability agencies, along with other parties. And then the second key thing is really getting these plans set up so that they are avoiding or mitigating undesirable effects of groundwater use. They're not all doing that well yet, the plans that have come in so far. And this, again, is really local lead, but we've added here that there's important roles for state and federal support, especially on making sure that there is safe drinking water in rural communities. This is often an area where there's partly a supply issue, partly a quality issue, and a lot of room for collaboration among parties to make this happen. The second big block is navigating trade-offs in market design. This is the sort of making sure that markets are both effective and responsible. So we've highlighted a number of specific recommendations, and local, state, and federal entities all need to be involved here. I'd say that key state entities here include the State Water Project as well as the regulatory agencies, and on the federal side, the Central Valley Project, in addition to federal regulatory agencies. First off, adopting effective and responsible approval strategies. That means there's potential for streamlining, a number of hacks to our current process that can allow good oversight, but still make it more streamlined and easier to do. The second group is refining Delta regulations. So the Delta is a big hub, and right now it's a big obstacle. And part of that is physical infrastructure, but a lot of it is regulatory. We have some suggestions on that, and that is really a state and federal area for work. Third is addressing local and regional impacts of land fallowing to make it easier for folks to feel comfortable with trading. And this is where there are a number of things that locals can do. And then there's some other areas where both, state, federal, and locals can all be playing a very important role. Better information and equitable rules for water trading, making smart infrastructure investments to improve the hydrologic connections, and promoting local collaboration. And this last one, we don't even put local there because this is really about how the state and the feds can come in with incentives and both a regulatory and financial nature to help out. So this is going to be hard work, but we think it's really going to be worth it. And there are actually a lot of promising things underway in some of the areas that we're recommending. SGMA is going to be transformational for adapting to our changing climate. Market tools can help soften the transition. The good news is that most of these reforms can be done without new legislation, but it's going to take engagement and leadership at all levels. And we've got some of the great leaders in our panel that we're going to hear from right now. So I know they're going to help us think about next steps. And with that, I will remind you to submit your questions, PPIC event questions at gmail.com. Say who you are when you do that. And thanks so much. Going to pass it over to Andrew.
Hello. Thank you for the introduction, Ellen. I'm going to introduce our panelists here in just a moment, but before I do that, I'd like to just remind everybody that they have more extensive bios posted on our website right now. So if you're interested in looking at those, you can go to the event page. So I'll just do brief introductions. And I'll start with Stephanie Anagnoson, Director of Water and Natural Resources for Madera County. And we'll also be having Thaddeus Bettner, General Manager at Glenn-Colusa Irrigation District. And finally, Kathy Cortner, the General Manager at the Mojave Water Agency. So thank you all three for taking the time to join us today. And we're going to have a little bit of a round of opening salvos here where the panelists can talk about their experiences with water markets and banking and their importance for SGMA. And I think we'll start with Kathy. So why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit of your insight. Thank you.
Okay. All right, I wanted to make sure I was unmuted. So yes, Kathy Cortner, Mojave Water Agency General Manager. Mojave Water Agency is in the high desert of Southern California. To give you a little perspective on approximately where we're halfway between the Los Angeles and Las Vegas in the high desert there off the 15. So we are one of 29 state water project contractors, and we are also the court-appointed water master. So the majority of our basin was adjudicated back in the 1990s, and after years of overdraft, and in 1996, we entered into a judgment. And what that judgment did was set the framework for allocating what we call a base annual production right, or base water right that people started with. Over time, the judgment calls for us to ramp that down until we get into what's called production safe yield. So that ramp down occurs over time, and it provides a glide path, a way for people to adapt and adjust to a declining amount of water to pump for free. So as we ramp them down, we call that new water, their pre-production allowance. And what the judgment allows all of our, what we call stipulators to do is if they don't need all of that water, if they're able to conserve or they have land fallowing, they are able to transfer and trade that water amongst themselves. If they can't find a party to buy it from, then of course they come and buy it from Mojave Water Agency, and we take the State Water Project water and recharge it into our groundwater basin. So we don't do direct delivery. We are more of a basin manager, and so we rely solely on recharging into our groundwater aquifer. So what that's done is in the early years, there was a lot of excess water out there available for the parties. And so water, they were able to get it a lot cheaper than they could from Mojave Water Agency or the State Water Project. Over time, as that amount of water became less and less, the market starts to get saturated and then the prices go up. So I always called it the glide path into sustainability. In addition, what we do is start part of the State Water Project contractors is we have engaged in water banking and water marketing. And so we are currently working on expanding the water banking. We have done water banking in the past where we've had obligations of our return of our State Water Project water, but in a dry year that doesn't add water to the system. We really need a banking program that provides pump back into the aqueduct and not relying on using our State Water Project allocation in these really low years as a return mechanism. So we're currently working on developing that. And we're also very active in supplying our State Water Project allocation to others during droughts. Since we only recharge basins, we are able to be 100% independent from the Delta and from our State Water Project in dry years. So that's, hopefully I didn't get into too much detail there. So.
Oh, that was perfect. Thank you very much, Kathy. Now I'm going to move on to Tad. If you'd like to give us a little bit of the view from the Sacramento Valley, that would be wonderful.
Sure, Andrew. Thanks, and good morning, everybody, and welcome from Northern California. Andrew, want to thank you and Ellen and PPIC for the report and taking on these tough policy issues. I think the document you put together in a policy brief are just great tools to start our conversation. So thanks to you for that. Just want to provide a perspective from our district. So we're Glenn-Colusa Irrigation District. We're up in the upper part of the Sacramento Valley. We are a historical water right holder going back to the 1880s, and part of the Central Valley Project is a Sacramento River settlement contractor. And so we have a lot of experience primarily around the diversion and delivery of surface water, but certainly are getting more active in the groundwater and the SGMA conversations as well. And maybe I just thought I'd provide a couple perspectives on both of those and just kind of how we're seeing things going forward. Just first from a surface water perspective, and I guess focusing on water transfers and water markets. I think kind of just as Ellen laid out, we've had a lot of experience in water transfers, and I think with that, we've really tried to focus on making sure we're trying to meet our local demands and needs first. So we have neighbors who sometimes fall short of water. So we have transfer policies, actually district policies in place that help us track and govern how we conduct our transfers. And that includes, how we make our landowners whole, addressing third-party impacts. And then we also use a lot of our funding for actually funding restoration projects. So, making sure we have a benefit to the environment is really a critical part of our policies as well. And we want to take a lot of those experiences and really apply them to where SGMA and groundwater and markets may be going. To that effect, we did have an opportunity when SGMA was formed to be our own GSA, but really partnered with our neighbors, with the counties, with other districts to actually form GSAs that are governed by joint board authorities. And so, we want to be good partners, good stewards of the resource and work together. So, we as a district where we could have been one GSA and potentially one GSP, now we are part of 3 different GSAs and working in 2 different GSPs. So, quite a handful. But again, we see working in our region is vitally important. And to that effect, we've really wanted to focus on developing those GSPs that had water budgets, that had good modeling, to where that could be the foundation of making decisions, and just also understanding and respecting the needs of current groundwater users, the environment around us, et cetera. So those were really important principles for us as we kind of carved our path forward and how we participate in these groundwater activities. And I think, as Ellen laid out, really addressing those essential features of SGMA are going to be really important. So that's something we're certainly committed to. And kind of then relating those to markets and rules, I think it's going to be really important as we move forward that I think a lot of folks get concerned when they hear the word market, and how do we use that in a positive context versus people getting concerned that they may be impacted. So we want to make sure we're ushering that sort of new process forward very carefully. Again, working with our partners, and also just trying to learn some lessons from the water rights system. Even as we try to use the current surface water rights system for transfers today, there's folks out there that want to change that system. So I'm not sure what they want to change it to, but they want it changed. And so I think we want to make sure as we look at any system that may also be used for a groundwater rights system, that we have a good system built going forward. And then lastly, I think we just need to also look at expectations of, what will the markets and transfer process around groundwater really do? Is it going to address the scarcity that we have? That's a big question. How much water is available? That's another big question. And while we've talked about, transfers and doing markets and groundwater for the benefit of other agencies' interests or lands, we also see as one of the big needs for potentially the market around groundwater could be the environment as well. We did an indirect transfer this year of groundwater pumping where that water was left in river for the benefit of the environment. So we see environmental need going forward. Certainly there's delta outflow needs around some of the actions by the State Water Resources Control Board. So it could be that some of the markets that we develop actually benefit the environment too. So we see that as part of the conversation. So hopefully that kind of just lays out some, at least initial thoughts, kind of what we're thinking up here, and certainly look forward to the questions in the panel and online. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Ted. And for our final panelist, we'll be pivoting to a different region of the state, down in the San Joaquin Valley, but also coming back to questions about groundwater markets and how to set them up. So Stephanie, if you'd like to take a moment to share some of your initial thoughts, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. So Madera County GSA is 215,000 acres. It includes both irrigated and a lot of non-irrigated and never irrigated acres. So of the 215,000 acres, about 120,000 is irrigated, and the rest is rangeland. Most of Madera County is a disadvantaged community, or in some cases, a severely disadvantaged community. We have land in 3 subbasins: Madera, Chowchilla, and the Delta Mendota. And the Madera County GSA has been working through a portfolio of programs that are in its GSPs. We have an allocation that's in place right now of sustainable yield and transition water. We have aggressive recharge activities planned. We're looking at land repurposing, both setting aside irrigated acreage, as well as potentially paying never irrigated acreage to stay never irrigated. And one of the strategies we are looking at is a groundwater market for trading allocations of sustainable yield. And this was something that growers came to us initially and wanted us to pursue in terms of adding flexibility as we manage with water scarcity. So we've applied for a Bureau of Reclamation grant, the Water Smart Water Market Strategy Grant, and we're towards the end of that process. We've done stakeholder interviews with key parties, from farmers to representatives of disadvantaged communities, to Cattlemen's Association. We've done 3 big public workshops to talk through what rules we might use in a groundwater market. And we're now in a simulation. We're in month 7 of 9, where every month is a different year from 2020 to 2040 as we simulate water scarcity, and allow people to trade groundwater allocations. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. So with those initial thoughts out there, I'd like to first circle back to one of the key questions that is highlighted in our report about groundwater allocations. So in many cases, groundwater allocations are set up in such a way that people receive an initial allocation to perhaps a set amount or what they were pumping before, and then those allocations are ramped down over time to reach sustainable yield in aggregate to balance the basin. There are a lot of factors that go into determining how fast the ramp down should be, whether the transitional water, so the additional pumping beyond the sustainable yield, should be tradable, and other things of that nature. So I'd like to sort of call on both Kathy and Stephanie to weigh in on what were the big factors that went into determining how the ramp down was determined and whether the transitional water was tradable in your cases. So why don't we start with Kathy, please, if you could weigh in on that.
Sure, I'll do my best. Yeah, the judgment was before my time here at the agency, so I'll give you my best secondhand recollection of what I've been told. But yeah, that was part of a negotiated settlement among the parties to decide. They chose a baseline year, and of course, everyone wants the most, and so the highest year. So, it was an unsustainable amount, but that's okay. You start with something, and then you work into the sustainability over time. They had agreed on a ramp down over time at 5% per year. As we started implementing that and doing the ramp downs, in the early 2000s, there were some concerns about the speed at which that was being done. So there were some years where I think we backed off a little bit on that, allowing people time to adjust. The goal was to get to safe yield over time, but it wasn't to, just get there immediately and rip the rug out of everyone. There were a lot of farmers in agriculture out here that have been here for generations that were at risk, and alfalfa was not a high enough value crop to pay for the water that was needed to get us into sustainable yield. So allowing the trading, which in the early years, again, there was a lot of water on the market, so it wasn't so expensive, and it took quite a few years. We're still in the final years of the ramp down. So now the water is a lot more expensive, but that glide path, allowing that trading, and we didn't put any strings on it. It was willing buyer, willing seller. You just had to keep it within the basin. And it really allowed them to control their destiny, determine the timing, and allow them to adapt and adjust and to their, getting into safe yield. We did lose a lot of farming, a lot of land fallowing, especially with the low value crops. Some were able to permanently purchase some water, but I would say there was a lot of movement from agriculture over to M&I during this 20-year time frame.
Great, thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Stephanie and also sort of highlight the question that it sounds like, Stephanie, so in the Mojave case, that transitional water was tradable. It sounds like in the Madera case, it's just going to be sustainable yield that's tradable. So maybe highlight that also, that point as well, if you can.
Sure. So our simulation does look only at trading sustainable yield, but of course, any final rules would need to go in front of our Board of Supervisors, acting as the Board of Directors for the GSA. So in terms of a glide path, we looked at transitional water as a bucket that was decreasing over time. And through many stakeholder meetings, including an advisory committee of representatives of the county GSA, we have a 2% reduction at first for 5 years and then 6% after. So that totals 100%, meaning 100% of the transitional water is reduced. There are a couple misconceptions about the 2%. So just to give you an idea, we have mainly almonds, pistachios, and grapes. So the average ET evapotranspiration of applied water for almonds, average including young and old, is about 34 inches historically. The allocation for next year is 28 inches. So from 34 to 28 is a pretty significant reduction right off the bat, even though the glide path is only 2%.
Great, thank you. Next, I'd like to take it back to Tad for a minute to talk about, first of all, maybe Tad, can you go into a little bit more detail about how it is that you meet local needs when thinking about transferring water out of the district? I'd like to hear a little bit more of that, and I'm sure our audience would too. And in addition, you mentioned that finding funding, whether through the proceeds of transfers or maybe other sources for environmental benefits, is important. And it would be nice to hear a little bit more about how that gets done and sort of what are the factors or considerations that go into that.
Yeah, sure. So the first question, Andrew, I think on transfers is really, we see transfers as just one of the many tools that we use to manage our different water supplies needs within the district. And primarily we're doing transfers in drier years when there's a need for water. And interestingly, what we find is that particularly, at least for our demand pattern for water, we tend to use water a little bit earlier in the year when oftentimes there's also a need or desire to want to try and save some of that water for later season fishery benefits. And so when we've done transfers, we've actually held that water up in storage and benefited, for example, cold water pool benefits in Shasta Reservoir for the benefit of winter run salmon. So that transfer has really provided an environmental benefit. And then also just from the actions that we take, typically through land fallowing, the revenues that we receive from those transfers, we don't keep the money, the district doesn't, but we actually have to pay the landowners for that action taken to set their ground aside for a year. So, and then what we do is we do keep a small percentage of that, and that's the money that we put into reserves for completing fishery restoration projects. So we take that money, we go, we have monitoring activities we conduct at our diversion structure. We go 70 miles upstream in Sacramento River and do fish restoration projects, oftentimes on our own or cost sharing with our other agencies. So really trying to lay out, again, those needs ahead of time and policies is really important, and I think we would see the same thing in some of the GSP activities and working with our local GSAs of continuing those activities. So whether, water is taken out of the river, direct diversion surface water, or it's pumped, it's all potentially affecting surface water and the environment. So, we look to some of our groundwater pumping neighbors to help us with some of these restoration projects. Can we use some of those funds that, could generate, water for groundwater banking activities. But again, there's other needs that some of this funding could also serve as well.
Great, thank you very much. We've got just over 5 minutes until we start audience Q&A, and I do want to get a couple more questions in here. The first is taking it back to Stephanie. You mentioned that Madera is in large part made up of some disadvantaged communities, many of which may have very shallow wells. Can you describe to what extent the county, through either GSP formulation or the formulation of the market in particular, is taking into account shallow wells and providing either protections or ways to address potential impacts?
Sure. So our GSPs outlined domestic well mitigation programs. And so what we're looking at doing is putting a proportion of the cost into the county GSA rate study. So this would be money that could help people replace their wells if they go dry during SGMA implementation. In terms of the market itself, one rule that's come up a bunch of times from different people is whether or not you could put buffer zones either around communities or along ecosystems, rivers, that sort of thing, so that you wouldn't increase the amount of pumping adjacent to a community or a river. So those are kind of top level ideas on how that can be addressed.
And what's the status of buffer zones? Is it still in a discussion phase? Have there been any concrete proposals around that?
We are using buffer zones in the simulation, so we're going to see what happens with that. But we haven't seen a ton of trading in our simulation, which kind of raises this other issue because water markets are a fair amount of time and energy being put in, and you may not be providing a benefit to everybody if there's not a ton of trading.
Right, as we highlight in the report, there are several different enabling conditions for a water market, and one is willing buyers and sellers who have value differentials that they need to resolve. I will note now that we do have 5 minutes until audience Q&A, so I'm going to remind everybody that if you'd like to get your questions in, go ahead and send them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Okay, so to continue with the panel for a moment, I'd like to turn it back to Kathy and ask her, to talk a little bit more about groundwater banking in the Mojave, especially for external parties, not Mojave Water Agency. So how that works and whether it's expanding and what's the future of groundwater banking in the Mojave, Kathy?
Okay. Yeah, so historically, we've experimented with the groundwater banking program. We did with Metropolitan Water District, where they banked some water in our service area. And, we had different terms of, value exchange that occurred there. And, but what it did, the way it's currently set up is we would have to return our table A water, whatever DWR allocated to us in a dry year, that would be then sent to Metropolitan. And a little bit more nuanced in that, I'm not going to get into all the details. One of the challenges we had, though, was that then tied up all of the dry year where water out of the Delta, that then, there were others like small agencies up north that needed water for health and safety needs. It really kind of tied our hands a little bit. And when I thought about it, I thought it really doesn't add water to the system in a dry year. You really need to have that pump back to be able to do one, larger volumes of water to return in those dry years. Two, to have the dual, adding water to the system, so it's not just obligating a limited allocation pool. So we have been undergoing a study for the last several months to looking at different areas in our basin to do some pump back. So we've been spending the last 5 years doing a lot of geotechnical work, identifying prime locations. We have been looking more recently at more of the marketing, the fine tuning the locations and the wells, and identifying potential partners in that. So we're getting into the final stages. We're starting to develop some of the groundwater banks and test sites that we see promising. And so I'm hoping in the next few years, by the time you get through all the CEQA and all the other hurdles there, to be able to have something online where we are able to pump back into the aqueduct.
Okay, and
Okay.
Great, thank you. To get one more question in before Q&A, back to Stephanie, you guys in Madera have received a grant, a water market design grant that has helped support your work. Can you speak a little bit about how that's been valuable and what other kind of support could be valuable for developing these kinds of markets?
Sure. So the Bureau of Reclamation Water Smart Water Market Strategy Grant is for $200,000 tops. So we have $200,000 of that money to pay for engineering, economic analysis, and outreach, and some legal analysis too. And then we matched it with $200,000 in staff time over 3 years. So not a small dollar amount, but I think water markets like Fox Canyon had a lot more invested, particularly on for meters and telemetry on their end. What would have been helpful for us in terms of guidance would have been maybe more on step-by-step how to develop an allocation, because that took about 2 years. And while there are some white papers and NGOs, there certainly wasn't kind of state guidance on that. And that for people in the Central Valley, that's kind of where SGMA is leading. So that would have been useful.
Perfect. Thanks again to all the panelists. And we're going to move into some audience questions right now. So the first one that, and I'll invite Ellen back into the Zoom here. The first audience question that we'll pick up right now is from Carl Seckel of the Municipal Water District of Orange County, who asks, how is the state promoting water trading or banking, and is the state doing enough at this time? Stephanie, you just kind of touched on this a little bit with the guidance question, but are there other thoughts from any of our panelists at this time?
So this is Kathy. The only thing I'll add is, historically we've had some challenges under our contract with DWR on, where it's pretty limited on how you could transfer exchange water, and it create some bottlenecks. It took a long time to get any of those into place. So, the years gone by and the need has now passed. We recently did the Water Management Tools Amendment, and we're in year 1 of implementing that. And so just in time for a really dry year, in fact, so the timing couldn't have been better. And so far it has removed those bottlenecks. We've been able to be much more expeditious and more flexible and getting the transfers in, and willing buyer, willing seller. And so far, so good. So I think that Water Management Tools Amendment was key to helping to free up the market for us, for the state water project.
This is that. I'll maybe two pieces on that real quick. Just one on the groundwater side. I think DWR has been great to help fund development. A lot of our GSPs, I think all of the GSAs up here developing a GSP received, $1 million grant for helping develop the GSPs, which are due, the beginning of next year. And I think DWR was great in terms of getting the contracts out, amendments, the money in hand, et cetera. So really appreciate the groundwater division within DWR for that effort. And then just on the surface water transfers, DWR and the Bureau of Reclamation have kind of developed an online approval process, which I think has been really helpful to, I think, one, just expedite the process and tracking of transfers. I think also it's probably made those actions more transparent as well. So again, just trying to continually evolve on reducing some of the burdens on transfers have been helpful, and just using, a lot of the technology in hand to make the processes quicker has been great too.
Thanks, Tad. That was a common theme in our discussions with stakeholders, was the timing and expeditiousness of transfers could be improved. So that's good to hear. We have an additional audience question from Megan Ashuri, a water resources engineer at the Bay Area Water Supply and Conservation Agency. They ask if any of the speakers have recommendations on how to better represent the needs of marginalized groundwater users as it relates to water markets, especially since the majority of small disadvantaged communities are not participating in the GSAs formed that impact them. So that is Megan Ashuri's question. Does anybody on the panel have initial thoughts on that?
Sure. I think that when you have stakeholder discussions, you need to make sure that you are inviting everybody, that the table's big enough for everybody to have a seat. But then if you have people who aren't able to come to the discussion, that you're going to them and meeting them where they meet, whether it's joining a community meeting or even going door to door and trying to get your finger on the pulse of what's going on there.
Yeah, I would just add from our perspective and how we formed our GSAs, we've included some of the small rural systems in our governance structure. And then we also have the counties that sit on our GSA, and both the counties that we've been working with, Glenn-Colusa, have been really strong in terms of trying to do broader, reaching out to parts of the community, try and get stakeholders to show up at public meetings. We've not had meetings just during the day, but on evenings, I think we've put out material in different languages. So I think, again, just want to give a lot of credit to the counties to try and reach some of those folks that I think, as the questioner asked, sometimes are hard to reach or don't want to be reached. But again, just really appreciate the efforts of the counties in using the resources they have to be able to do that.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the responses. The next question that we have from the audience is from Dennis O'Connor, Chief Consultant for the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Water, who asks, how do you see the establishing of secure tradable rights short of adjudication? And so this is, again, something that we highlighted in the report, which is that there's a need, there's an upfront need for groundwater markets to exist, for allocations and tradable allocations to be defined. In the past in California, this has typically been done via adjudication, court adjudication, that can sometimes take a long time and be quite expensive for parties. SGMA opens the door to maybe do this without adjudication. I think this is a good question, actually, for all of our panelists. Kathy's, been in a basin that's been through an adjudication, and the other two not quite yet. But what do you see as opportunities for establishing these secure tradable rights short of adjudication?
I'm not sure I understand exactly where that's going, and I guess speaking for our local community here, unless there's a forcing function to force people to have to buy water, I don't know that there's an incentive to want to trade the water, or find other ways of finding the, less expensive water to provide that glide path. So I'm not sure I totally understand the question or where that's exactly going.
I think the question is oriented towards understanding how we could craft allocations that are tradable, so set limits for individual pumpers short of going through a court adjudication process. So there are examples in other groundwater basins in the state where allocations have been set up without going through a court adjudication. Now there are trade-offs there, and so I think that's that's the part of the thrust of the question.
Yeah. So having that limitation on how much water you can use locally, that's kind of the forcing function, right? So whether it's an adjudication or you do the SGMA and voluntarily come to the table to set those limits on how you're going to share resources and share the basin amongst yourselves. So I think to the extent you can have people working together to do that, that's the best course of action. Doesn't always work that way, but that would be the best course of action. And then, from my perspective, I feel like what we've done here has worked well. Don't limit people just to the production safe yield of the basin for the trading amount. If you're really going to provide that glide path and allow people to adjust and adapt to something different and something new lifestyle, we've allowed the full pre-production allowance, which was higher than the production safe yield. So as we went down over time to get our free production down to the safe yield, we did allow that trading to occur, again, with willing buyer, willing seller. That flooded the market. Water prices start out low. Over time, they go up in time. So it really does provide a good glide path when you allow that, from my perspective.
Great. I guess just building on this question, Stephanie, you guys are in Madera in the process of defining allocations without having gone through an adjudication. How has that process been? And was there ever any sense that it would not be able to happen without an adjudication?
I found the process extraordinarily painful, and it took about 2 to 3 years, pretty much the entire time that we've been here. But we did get it done. We have specific numbers associated to allocations adopted in June. So we did get it done without an adjudication.
Great, thank you. We'll move on from that to another audience question that we have here, which is from Ansel Lundberg of the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. the question is, have the panelists seen any examples of easement-like tools being developed to encourage retiring land from groundwater irrigation and repurposing its use? Would SGMA compliance encourage these kinds of conservation tools? So I know, Stephanie, you mentioned earlier that there were plans to maybe pay never irrigated areas not to irrigate. I don't, maybe that qualifies as an easement-like tool, but I would just open the floor for any panelists who have experience with that or who have thoughts about that to weigh in.
Andrew, I think it's a great question. We don't have any direct experience in that. I think, however, we'll be interested. I know we have lands around us that aren't developed, that we've seen new lands coming into production, which are groundwater dependent, which I think we're very concerned about, given we're kind of currently on the cusp of sustainability, but maybe not quite. So any new demand will continue to put us further out of balance. So I do think the question asked is a right question, because I think you go in and give people a credit or pay them to maintain a certain land use over another. That's a great question. Obviously, again, that's another issue we want to work with the counties, because ultimately the counties are the ones that are the land use authorities and have the land use authority, and how can we partner with them to achieve some of those outcomes will be pretty important.
Yeah, I'll just add on to what Thaddeus said. In Mojave, I guess in hindsight, would we do something different? We over time, we've been about, willing buyer, willing seller, allow the market to dictate the use of the land. And so some of the land fallowing occurred because of economics, where we went from ag to M&I. One of the challenges we're faced with now is there's a new type of ag where the cost of water doesn't matter. And that's, the cannabis issues. It's just explosive here in our desert region, and trying to get a handle on that and figure out how you bring them into the judgment. The pumping is less than what we have tools for under the judgment. So having tools available to you for new types of land use, new types of pumping, and especially those that fall under the radar, like the less than 2 acre feet under SGMA, having plans of how you're going to deal with them and collect the revenues needed to offset their pumping. Yeah, thinking ahead about that, I think, is key.
Great. So I think we have one more question that Ellen would like to introduce. So I'll turn it over to her for a moment.
So 15 minutes before this event started, the governor signed some bills that the legislature had been negotiating right down to the wire, and that includes a lot of money for water resilience. It includes a little piece for exactly this kind of issue, which is a new program for, I think it's multi-benefit farmland repurposing, something like that. And this is the idea of incentivizing folks who are going to be transitioning lands from full-time irrigation into something, and trying to make it work in a way that is beneficial and not just a blight. So I know that's exciting. It's small, but it's exciting for folks to start thinking about this in the San Joaquin Valley. Certainly, I just wanted to mention it's a piece of maybe good news.
Okay. Well, with that, I think I will start wrapping things up. Actually, we have a little bit of time for just a quick lightning round. I'd like to take just one quick moment from each panelist to respond to the following question, which is, we're in the midst of another major drought. It's just starting. At least this is the first year of one. This is early on in the SGMA implementation time horizon. Given the timing of this drought and the severity of it, how has that affected your thinking about SGMA implementation and the importance of trading, and especially groundwater banking? So why don't we start with Tad, just a quick lightning round answer. We've got just a couple minutes left.
Well, I would just say, in the development of our GSAs, as we had governance come together in our GSPs, there was kind of a lot of hypotheticals of what could happen or what should the GSPs potentially address. I would say this drought has kind of made those issues front and center and made the conversations go from theoretical to realistic. So potentially, don't let a crisis go to waste is the, common phrase. So I would say that's very true of this year.
Okay, great. Thank you. Kathy, any thoughts on the drought?
Yeah, so for us, we're a little bit more mature in our basin, 25 years into an adjudicated basin. So we've been planning for this for quite a while. And because we don't do direct deliveries, we recharge basins. This drought, we're pretty much prepared for. So we were able to, in wet years, we pre-stored close to about 180,000 acre feet to meet our future demand. So we have more than enough water pre-stored in our basin. So we've been able to make all of our table A water allocation from DWR available to others to use. So for us, we're in a good position.
Excellent. And finally, Stephanie?
Well, I would hope that the drought would put pressure on all entities in the Madera and Chowchilla basins to look seriously at funding domestic well mitigation, because wells are going dry throughout, not just the county GSA, but irrigation districts as well.
Great, thank you. So we are at time, and I'd like to end by thanking both our panelists, Ellen for her presentation, and the funders of this work, alongside everybody who tuned in today to take part in this webinar. I'll put a little plug in that next week on the 30th, we have another webinar about a different report related on groundwater and urban growth in the San Joaquin Valley. So that'll be next week on the 30th. And finally, if you pre-registered for this event, you should receive a survey afterwards, and we would appreciate if you could fill out that survey. The responses are important. So with that, I'll end, and thank you very much.